So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and hopefully my presentation will be interesting and spark off some discussion and debate. I'm going to move on to share my slides. So hopefully people can see the slides themselves. They're very orange, which is our kind of Strathclyde University humanities and social science colour of the slide deck. So what I'm really talking about today, and I'm just going to minimise everyone so I can't see anyone any longer, is what's needed to improve One Health AMR approaches. And it's a UK perspective from a small study, but I'll be telling you about this in more detail. So it's not work that I've done alone by any means. I think this sort of project came from discussions with Mark a few years ago, and the project itself was completed just prior to COVID, and it was a large group of people who worked on this. Most importantly, Rebecca Laidlaw, who very sadly died just after she'd worked on this. So it's a bit of a sad story behind this. And I'm currently here in Australia, in Melbourne, and working on Mark's sister study. And I'll touch on that very briefly at the end of my presentation. So what I'm really going to talk through is give you an overview of One Health AMR approaches, and then sort of a bit of a deep dive into an empirical study where looking at diverse experts from the UK about what they saw as barriers to implementing AMR One Health interventions, then experts' insights into the enablers of implementing AMR One Health interventions, and then give you some recommendations from the use of the behaviour change wheel, which is a sort of toolkit from the behavioural and implementation sciences that gives you a set of very concrete recommendations. And we'll talk about those recommendations before concluding. So that's really what we've got in store. I'll try and keep reminding you of where we are in terms of the talk and the different research questions as we go along. So a great place to start is around, well, what is One Health? And a wonderful description from WHO. One Health is an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognizes that the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment are closely linked and interdependent. And throughout the talk, I've tried to sort of find visuals that attempt to show what One Health might be. And you can see one of these on the right from a veterinary science article that looked at One Health approaches from last year's. But you can see this kind of, how we're thinking about it systemically, looking at that combination of different kinds of health, thinking very ecologically, and the connections between people's animals and the environment. So in terms of AMR and One Health, I suppose it's a rhetorical question about, is it a productive way to understand AMR? AMR is the outcome of a very complex system of varied stakeholders, sectors, industries, professions. And I think we'd all agree that it's driven by a range of biological, psychological, and social, environmental, political, and economic mechanisms. I think there is a growing interest in the complex journeys that our antimicrobials have outside of the individual bodies in which their biological mechanisms are intended to work. That's across species, across ecologies, or we could be far more global and think about those mechanisms across the planet. And accordingly, we need systemic approaches relating to the systems of AMR that stretch across these sectors, different species, and different nations. And they really are, I'm trying to wrap up in this phrase, one very clumsy phrase, I've got to admit, One Health AMR approaches or One Health AMR interventions. And in terms of, what is a kind of One Health AMR, then, here's a visual from the UK government from 2010. And this is one of a series of kind of system maps in which they were trying to sort of talk about the different drivers of antimicrobial resistance. And you can see here we've got human food, we've got human health on the upper right, we've got animal health, bottom left, and the environment, so bottom right. And these kind of complex diagrams to try and sort of show the complexity of the mechanisms that drive antimicrobial resistance and potentially interventions to mitigate it across a very complicated system there. Another sort of simpler way of looking at it, and I kind of like that visual on the right hand side when you kind of squeeze a balloon and essentially you're kind of moving things around. So, for the drivers of AMR and thinking systemically, it means that we're invited to think about what happens in a hospital ward, maybe affecting what happens in nearby rivers and lakes in terms of industrial effluent from a hospital. It might be about thinking, or we're being invited to think about what happens on a dairy farm and how it can affect what can happen within a family home in a larger city far, far away. So there's a whole science to thinking about systems, but basically they're sort of inviting us to think at a different level than a level we would tend to. It also means that what happens with dairy slurry on a farmer's field can happen and it can affect a family dog. And what vets do will eventually affect what dentists can do. And what happens in India will eventually affect what happens in Melbourne. So it leads you to think about things in a different kind of way if we think systemically at the macro level, rather than at smaller kind of levels of settings or systems that we might work in on our day jobs kind of thing. So just to wrap up this sort of introduction to One Health AMR approaches, the invitation to think about AMR systemically isn't new, but I think for those of us who've been working in AMR for a few years, I think it's reasonable to say that much of our attention, and indeed some of my own work in intervening within the drivers of AMR, has tended to focus within a sector or within a setting or a species, and hasn't really addressed the system level, that much bigger, much more complicated sort of macro perspective. So there's probably been very little progress with intervening systemically and progressing with One Health AMR interventions. And I suppose the talk today is about why is this taking place? Why is there this sort of slow progress? And how might we think about improving things and thinking and intervening more systemically? So that introduces the small empirical study that I'll be talking about in some detail. And it has 3 research questions. How do UK experts see the barriers to implementing One Health AMR approaches at the system levels? How did they see the enablers to implementing One Health AMR approaches at systems level? And then when using the behavior change wheel approach, what does that recommend us to do to improve and enhance One Health AMR approaches? So in terms of who the sample was, then we were trying to sort of have a sample which was from across that whole system. So the red dots relate to the participants that we purposefully recruited. And that did represent, participants from human healthcare, from the human food sector, from animal healthcare, from the environment, and other people from governments, academia in terms of UK funding organisations, charities, non-governmental organisations specialising in antimicrobial stewardship awareness. So we really tried to get a very diverse sample in order to be able to really deliver on the project itself. And what we did was, it is a small qualitative project. We got very diverse expert accounts. We did one-to-one telephone interviews, and if my memory serves me well, I think I did all of those interviews, which were a real joy to do. And we did a thematic analysis on this, so learning from those experts in terms of how they understood AMR, how they understood One Health, what they saw the barriers and enablers to One Health, delivering AMR One Health interventions. And then, as I said, we used the behavior change wheel, and I'll talk about that briefly when the time comes. But I think the thing to think about is we're not focusing here on, catheter-associated urinary tract infections in care homes. We're trying to focus on the systems level, this much bigger top layer of complex issues, and then what makes it easy and difficult to sort of intervene and reduce AMR at that level rather than any of the sort of smaller levels underneath it. So in terms of research question one, what were the barriers? So our analysis really highlighted 5 key barriers. And I'll just talk about them briefly here before going on to look at them in more depth and detail. So we identified the complexity of AMR itself in terms of gaps in science, limited screening and monitoring were real barriers to implementing One Health AMR approaches. We found that the effects of public indifference were also a major barrier in terms of the salience of AMR, a lack of awareness of AMR in the general public, or contradictory information. We found in terms of governance that differences between sectors that spanning AMR span multiple governmental departments and silos was problematic. We found that finance issues were also a major barrier in terms of resource limitations or competing financial interests. And then we also found what we've called them versus us, that there was very silo-specific working, that there was a lack of global responsibility of AMR. And perhaps most interesting to social scientists was the kind of reciprocal blame between different sectors. But as I said, we'll look at these in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. So major barrier one, the complexity of AMR. The experts really highlighted that we can struggle with a common language for key concepts, that each profession or sector sees the issue of AMR from its own perspective, that there's a sense of different bits of the system only see parts of the whole. That idea of trying to understand an elephant with a blindfold, if people are only touching different little bits, they're not going to see the whole. And then another key aspect was without holistic, accurate monitoring of AMR across species and environments, it's difficult to understand the scale of AMR, the AMR problem, to monitor trends and wider changes at a more systemic level. So we've got an illustrative quote from one of the funding organizations here. And I think one of the main challenges that we currently face is understanding how does resistance emerge and flow so that we have a better understanding, because at the moment we have snapshots of resistance in these different pockets and we don't really have a joined up linked model to be able to really evaluate where the primary risk is arising from. So it gives you a real sense of how the complexity of AMR and different professional perspectives on it really problematize us being able to sort of grasp it and act on it to reduce AMR. The next key theme I want to talk about is that the diverse experts talked about public indifference being a barrier to implementing One Health AMR approaches. And if we think about it, the general public of voters, taxpayers, and consumers of various AMR-related services and products, we could argue that they underpin the AMR system. It's probably, widely acknowledged that the public maybe don't understand antimicrobial resistance and that they don't understand One Health. Although you could argue that with issues such as climate change, there is a sort of growing recognition from amongst the public of more systemic thinking. We've got an extract from an agricultural sector representative, and they said, I think personally the biggest challenge is getting the public on side. One of the things that I've noticed myself, if you try and put something to the public that's going to be an issue in 10 years or 20 years time, they don't care. It just needs to be an issue that's happening just now. Third barrier is diverse experts noted that reciprocal blame and responsibility prevented systems change. This is that idea of them versus us. So there was a clear sense of sector-specific silos and identities. There was widespread distrust, suspicion, or competition. There was a sense that every sector blames another sector for the issue of AMR. And there's a sense that responsibility for action tends to be diffused across the system rather than shared and embraced across the system. So we've got a series of extracts here that kind of in polar opposites to each other. Firstly, from someone from the agricultural sector. Well, the biggest part to play is in the human medicine. That's where the problem is. Let's not beat around the bush on this. It's human medicine that's the problem in the main. Or from the human health sector, from the human medicine sector. So both sides probably don't know what the other side's doing. And have heard them blame each other. It's the farmer's fault. It's not ours, or vice versa. Or finally, from the human health sector. Well, if you're taking a one world view, is there any point in doing something in the UK when you've got how many billion people traveling in and out of the UK? You can't just do it on farms. You just do it, or you just do it in the hospital, or just do it in the UK. It's got to be everywhere. So again, a sense of just how these scale of the challenges make it difficult to act on AMR One Health. In terms of another key barrier is the financial drivers that prevent One Health AMR systems change. That funding to change the system rather than the parts tends not to be available. That financial drivers and opportunities across sectors are very different. In the UK, profit being veterinary medicine versus non-profit being the NHS, the National Health Service. And financial support goes within sectors and specialities and not to collaborative One Health systemic work. So from an expert from the microbiology sector says, I think a recognition that a One Health problem needs One Health solutions. So you need to be ensuring that the money gets to the One Health community and not be stuck through one tier dominating or deciding where it goes in a structure that allows it to happen. So again, really highlighting the importance of financial aspects at different levels, driving problems in implementing systemic One Health solutions. Finally, in terms of the last barrier I'll talk about, we have governance and regulatory structures presenting barriers to delivering One Health AMR. And I suppose this theme sort of taps into that recognition that there are many different goals and motivations across the system. If you think back to that system maps, the different stakeholders, the different agents within it, the kind of goals that drive their behaviors are very different to each other. So different professional regulations drive different behaviors, different power structures across organizations do exactly the same. And we've got an extract to illustrate this theme here. I think the challenges are always that everybody is aligned to a particular goal. Different stakeholders have different understandings and desires and outcomes that they wish to achieve. And I think when you're trying to work across sectors, coordinating those sectors and ensuring that we're all going for the same goal, being collegiate, which people increasingly are, but actually, how do you actually ensure compliance of purpose? So nice sort of way of ending the barriers to implementation. So moving on to the opposite of the barriers to implementation, I'm going to briefly talk about what we learned about the enablers of implementing One Health approaches. And again, we've got three distinct themes here from the data that really illuminate these particular issues. So the first that I'll talk about is effective leadership and professional buy-in. And this, our participants highlighted, could facilitate systems change. That efforts and leadership from international and national organizations, governments and individuals has managed in some places to cascade some change across the system to date. We've got an extract here from an academic research sector expert. From a societal point of view, there's massive drive from the UK government, certainly to the WHO, to bring AMR to the front of the problems or issues that we've got in society. And that's dramatic. So really showcasing the fact if you get the right people in place, they can really make things happen. In terms of the second key enabling theme, we've got the fact that our experts talked about those activities that facilitate interactions and mutual respect across sectors could really enable systems change. So they talked about the deliberate organization and management of cross-sector or interprofessional interactions and how deeply beneficial that could be to understanding and changing the system. An extract here from the human health sector, and the expert said, it's that collaborative exchange and support and network built around healthcare professionals, communities, non-governmental organizations, policymakers. That's the way ahead. And I feel quite strongly because I think it's the only way ahead. Finally, we have an enabler theme which really related to better measurement and surveillance. That was understood to drive AMR One Health systems change. So developing databases and surveillance was central to understanding the system. And data-driven approaches that facilitated feedback, reflection, social comparison across elements in the system could really be a driving force for good in terms of implementing One Health AMR approaches. And they're kind of classic behavior change techniques, enabling social comparison to drive change forwards. An extract that sort of illustrates these ideas comes from the agricultural sector, and the expert said, "We managed to establish the antibiotic use for all of the 70 farms, and it was really important that the farmer and the vet was aware of when we benchmarked the usage of each farm. The vets were also getting feedback in terms of their antibiotic usage of the individual farms. It was all anonymized, but they could see, vet practice A, for example, had 5 farms. Now, whether they were at the bottom end or the high end, it was all very transparent in terms of the results from their farms. So that idea could be scaled up and used to drive change forwards. So in terms of research question 3, this is how we used a set of tools from implementation science to sort of turn these barriers and facilitators into concrete recommendations. So if there's an interest, we can talk about this in a bit more detail. But basically, it's a set of tools that really, if you take a behavior, sort of implementing AMR One Health at the center, that kind of orange in terms of the dartboard looking thing on the right-hand side, and then you kind of look at the barriers and facilitators, which is what I've just been sort of talking us through. Then you very systematically map them to things like the theoretical domain framework or the Cone-Beam model of behavior change. So that kind of theorizes those barriers and facilitators. And then what the tools do, which is kind of very useful, is map them onto intervention functions or policy categories, these kind of outer layers that enable you to give sort of quite concrete, evidence-based, theoretically informed recommendations for change. So the tools are they're kind of cool because they do that in a very systematic and evidence-based way, but they're absolutely not perfect. But this slide, and don't worry about the details, is just trying to sort of show you take that barrier theme, you theorize it, we could theorize it with the theoretical domains framework as well. You literally map these on to intervention functions, policy categories, and then operationalize them to get very clear and concrete recommendations. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. What did we learn from our behavior change wheel analysis around potential intervention content? So if we take that first idea of the complexity of AMR, then really our behavior change wheel analysis said that we need to create new knowledge about systemic AMR. So make these sort of systems issues and priorities, make them knowable as a first sort of step in enabling change to happen. We also need to coordinate guidelines and legislation across sectors to promote the collaboration and aid AMR One Health understanding. In terms of recommendations from analysing that theme of public indifference as a barrier to delivering and implementing AMR One Health interventions, then the analysis suggested that we could use respected public figures to model the potential of the public in eliciting One Health AMR change. So what we could do with is One Health heroes who really promote and drive things forwards, who are recognisable figures. Similar to that, we might want to galvanise the public to drive the coordination of governmental and cross-sector activity through their role in terms of voting and activism and lobbying. So we need, as we have climate activists, we need One Health activists who can really move things forward through what they can do best. Relating to these is the idea that we could galvanise the public to drive One Health AMR change through the food industry and food production, through changing patterns of consumption, and demanding transparency around sort of antibiotic use, antibiotic disposal within retail. So this idea of sort of creating One Health consumers as a way of compensating for public indifference to AMR. Equally, in terms of that barrier theme of them versus us, we could have far-reaching sector-wide materials like social marketing interventions that sort of take the diverse stakeholders involved in that system and teach and persuade all stakeholders about the value of shared responsibility for One Health AMR, and problematize reciprocal blaming. It's you, it's not me, it's you, etc. And problematize that idea of the diffusion of responsibility that just means that change doesn't happen because everyone thinks it's someone else's responsibility. And we might want to work across and within organizational structures to provide scalable role models of owning responsibility amongst key opinion leaders. So show by example what could be done. In terms of something as complex as the financial drivers that prevent One Health AMR approaches, we could secure resources to work at the One Health system level, in addition to those resources that work within sectors. So what we need is dedicated One Health funding to enable change to happen. We might want to map the differences in financial drivers of AMR across that system to identify key areas of incompatibility, understand and make changes where the problems are, where those hotspots are in terms of financial disparities that drive AMR. In terms of governance, we might want to do the same kind of mapping exercise. Where are the problems in governance that lead to the lack of coordinated activity? Where are things not working in order for us to really target change where they could work better? We might also want to identify and then change examples of where organizational structures impede the coordination of One Health AMR activity. We might want to develop an infrastructure of connected bodies and organizations to coordinate diverse governance, regulation, and legislation and multiple structures, essentially making new social structures, new policy organizations that stretch right across the system in order to work at that systemic level. Related to that is we might want to really encourage cross-sector interaction. So specifying cascade models of where cross-sector and cross-nation collaboration has worked, celebrate successes, name them, share them, use them. We might want to work within professional and educational bodies to ensure that cross-sector and interprofessional work is valued and that the skills to deliver it are taught through educational and continuing professional development and initiatives. We might want to really find and train leaders across the system who can really work about promoting AMR One Health change. We might want to have communication and marketing interventions that build upon prior success, and we might want to develop guidance for best practice that does exactly the same. In terms of final recommendation, and from the analysis of measurement and surveillance, we might want formal education, continuing professional development that related to data-driven approaches to understanding AMR that related to One Health. We probably need exactly the same kind of elements that were focused on the creation, storage, and sharing of data across that system to be able to move forwards in data-driven ways. So I'm going to move on now just to kind of wrap up. And this has been a small pre-COVID study from the UK. And what it's really showed us is how diverse experts saw One Health AMR. And really the kind of take-home message would be it was complex. It was stretched across a multifaceted and multi-layered system. What we showed was there were a range of important barriers and facilitators to delivering systems change for One Health AMR. Using the behavior change wheel, we showed a series of potential recommendations that could be used to further One Health AMR approaches and move us forwards in relation to reducing AMR. So this data is slightly old, the analysis is slightly old, and maybe, it would be wrong just to take those recommendations as they are and sort of try and implement them within Scotland or the wider UK or other countries such as here in Australia. But I think, in terms of reflecting on these findings and just trying to think about what are the top level implications from the work we did here, remembering this is a small qualitative study, although it had a very good diverse sample of different experts. And I think what it invites us to do is to consider the system as well as the individual elements within it. And I think, if you look at any of the social science or the complex system science, it kind of acknowledges that human beings find it particularly hard to think about those very complex interactions and systems properties that are above the way our minds are really sort of, and social processes and social structures are geared towards understanding. So I also think, although we do need to work at this systemic level, we must not stop working with any particular element of the system. So we still need to work on rapid diagnostics. We still need to develop new antimicrobials. We still need to do things like hospital-based antibiotic stewardship. But we do need to imagine other complementary systemic ways of intervening that are above and encompass all of these smaller different ways of intervening, where probably most developments within the last 10 years have been happening. And it's that sort of constellation of different interventions that we need at different levels, probably across a considerable period of time, maybe even intergenerational time, is what we need to really transform the system to reduce antimicrobial resistance. So I don't think, and I'm not arguing that we should just throw all our resources into systems levels interventions and just hope for the best. There is some kind of careful consideration of coordinated, harmonized interventions at sort of particular hotspots in the system. And the behavior change wheel recommendations, I think, try to kind of map on in a very sensible way to some of where we might need to focus our interventions. So other key top-level implications would be that we should focus a significant proportion of available resource to working on the One Health AMR system itself, in addition to supporting work within elements of the system. We need to co-create and professionalize One Health AMR systems training. We need to ensure that AMR One Health education is provided and includes transdisciplinary communication and collaborative problem solving, because the problems and the solutions are not within any discipline, within any particular sector, but are across that system and at those particular hotspots and sort of connections and connectivity that probably is where we need to really focus our efforts. So my final slide really is, just now I'm here in Melbourne, and what I'm working on with Mark is a parallel Australian data set. So I think I only got here 48 hours ago, and what I've been doing is sort of looking at the data, and Mark and I are discussing sort of what I've presented here and the similarities and differences we're finding between the UK, mainly Scottish-based data set from pre-COVID to the data that's been collected here. And there are similarities, a lot of similarities, I would say so far, but there are key differences. So certainly the Australian data is much clearer on the issue of anthropocentrism. There's a clearer sense of historical and the cultural context here, with Aboriginal sort of belief systems, which are much more aligned with One Health than I think sort of more traditional sort of belief systems are within Scotland and the UK. And my quick glance at the data also is really showing these differences of rural and remote communities here, and the interrelationships between different species, people and their animals, seem much more intertwined here than they do from a Scottish or wider UK perspective. So our hope is to still use the same behaviour change wheel tools to develop a series of contemporary recommendations that are really based for the Australian context in terms of how we can deliver and improve on AMR One Health interventions.